My father gave me an ultimatum: either give up my inheritance or get out of the house. I chose the second option, and soon I made my family regret everything. You know, some families have golden children, and then there are, well, let's call them bronze. I was always the bronze kid, but not the Olympic kind. More like the participation trophy that gets shoved in a drawer somewhere and forgotten about until spring cleaning. My name's Paul Wilson, and this is the story of how I went from being invisible to, well, let's just say things got interesting. Real interesting. Growing up in suburban Ohio, I was what you'd call professionally average. Not bad enough to worry about. Not good enough to brag about. Just there, like beige paint or elevator music. My older brother Michael, though, man, that guy was everything I wasn't. 6'2", quarterback shoulders, smile that could sell insurance to the Amish. He had this way of walking into a room that made people straighten their spines, like gravity worked differently around him. My parents, William and Margaret Wilson, were good people. Don't get me wrong. They loved us both, I think. But love and attention are two different currencies, and Michael was getting paid in gold while I was collecting pocket change. Picture this. Every family dinner was like a highlight reel of Michael's latest achievements. State championship this, college scholarship that, girlfriend who looked like she stepped out of a magazine. I'd sit there pushing green beans around my plate, listening to Dad beam about his oldest son's latest conquest. Mom would nod and make those proud parent sounds that every kid wants to hear directed at them. Me? I worked part-time at Henderson's Hardware, had dreams about fixing up Grandpa Joe's old pickup truck, and spent way too much time reading car magazines instead of doing anything remotely impressive. That truck was my obsession. A 1979 Ford F-150 that had seen better decades. But I saw potential where everyone else saw scrap metal. The thing about being the invisible kid is that you get really good at reading a room. You learn to spot the exact moment when people's eyes glaze over when you're talking. You develop this sixth sense for when someone's about to change the subject to something more interesting, which usually meant anything involving Michael. I remember this one time when I was 13. Father's Day was coming up, and I spent hours making this handmade card. Not just any card. Mind you, I drew this elaborate picture of Dad and me fishing, wrote this poem about all the things I admired about him, even pressed some wildflowers between the pages like Mom taught me. Took me the better part of a week, working on it after my homework was done. So there I am, proud as punch, handing over this masterpiece to my old man. He looks at it, smiles, says thanks kiddo, and sets it down on the kitchen table. Right next to it, Michael tosses down his latest baseball trophy, some state-level thing he'd won that afternoon. Didn't even make a big deal about it. Just casually mentioned it while grabbing a soda from the fridge. Guess which one ended up on the refrigerator? When I came back an hour later, my card was still sitting there, but now it had the newspaper covering half of it. Michael's trophy was gleaming in the place of honor, right next to all his other achievements. That's when it hit me like a brick to the chest. I wasn't just overlooked, I was practically invisible. You ever feel like a ghost in your own house? Like you could walk through walls and nobody would notice the difference? That was my daily reality. But here's the thing about being invisible. It teaches you to see things others miss. While everyone was watching Michael's spotlight performance, I was learning to appreciate the shadows, the quiet corners, the stories that didn't make it into the family newsletter. And that's where Grandpa Joe comes into the picture. Joe Wilson was my dad's father. And if Michael was a golden child, then Grandpa Joe was a platinum standard of being human. This man had hands like leather gloves and a heart bigger than his farmhouse. He lived about 40 minutes outside town on this spread of land that seemed to stretch on forever when you're a kid. Rolling green hills, a barn that leaned just slightly to the left like it was listening to something in the distance, and that old pickup truck I mentioned earlier. See, everyone else in the family treated Grandpa's farm like it was some quaint weekend destination, a place to visit, take some pictures, maybe help with light chores before heading back to civilization. But for me, that farm was my sanctuary, my Atlantis, my fortress of solitude where I could actually breathe. Grandpa Joe didn't just see me. He saw through me, straight into the parts of my soul where all those unrealized dreams were hiding. The dreams my parents dismissed as childish fantasies. He'd watch me tinker with that old truck, getting my hands dirty, figuring out which parts still worked and which ones needed love, and he'd gnaw like I was performing surgery. While Michael was off being perfect at everything that mattered to everyone else, I was learning real skills. How to coax life out of an engine that hadn't run in years. How to read the weather by watching the way the corn moved in the wind. How to listen to what the land was trying to tell you. But there was something else about Grandpa Joe that made him special. The man collected stamps. Not in some obsessive, investment-minded way like you see on those antique shows. For him, those little pieces of paper were like a visual diary of all the places he'd never been but dreamed about visiting. He'd show me stamps from countries I couldn't pronounce. Tell me stories about the people whom I've licked them and sent them on journeys across oceans. I'd sit there for hours, listening to him weave tales about adventure and discovery, all centered around these tiny windows into the wider world. He taught me that every stamp had a story. Every postmark was proof that someone, somewhere, had something important enough to say that they trusted it to the mail system. Ralph Waldo Emerson once said something that Grandpa Joe lived by. Do not go where the path may lead. Go instead where there's no path and leave a trail. That old man taught me exactly that. How to find your own way even when nobody else can see the road you're walking on. Most afternoons after school, instead of going home to watch Michael dominate whatever sport was in season, I'd hop on my bike and pedal out to the farm. Grandpa would be waiting, usually with some project that needed doing or some story that needed telling. We rebuilt that pickup truck together, piece by piece, season by season. Every bolt we turned was like adding another page to our own private book. The funny thing is, my parents thought this was just another phase. Paul's going through his farming phase, they'd say, like it was something I'd grow out of, like a cartoon character obsession, or wanting to be a firefighter. They never understood that what I was really doing was learning to be myself for the first time in my life. Out there on the farm, I wasn't the disappointment son or the not quite good enough brother. I was just Paul, and that was more than enough for Grandpa Joe. He'd watch me struggle with some mechanical problem for an hour, never offering to do it himself, just being present while I figured it out. That kind of patience is rarer than platinum in today's world. But life has this way of keeping you humble, just when you think you've found your safe harbor. I was 16 when I decided to do something spectacular. Something that would finally make my parents see me the way Grandpa Joe did. Michael had just won some regional championship, and the house was buzzing with college recruiters calling and scholarship offers piling up like Christmas presents. I wanted in on that attention, that pride, that feeling of making your family's chest puff out when they talked about you. So I got this brilliant idea to surprise everyone by creating the perfect lawn. Now understand, Michael took care of our yard like it was the grounds of Augusta National. Every blade of grass stood at attention, edges sharp enough to cut paper, not a dandelion in sight. It was a summer job, and he approached it with the same methodical perfection he brought to everything else. The neighbors would actually slow down when they drove past just to admire the landscaping. I figure if I could make it even better, if I could add something special that would make Mom and Dad realize their younger son had hidden talents too, maybe I'd finally get my moment in the sun. What I created instead was what you might charitably call an agricultural disaster. Or, as Dad put when he saw it, something that looked like a beaver family had held a rave on our front lawn. I tried to install this elaborate flower border, complete with decorative stones, and what I thought were exotic plants I'd ordered from some catalog. Turns out those exotic plants were actually invasive weeds that spread faster than gossip in a small town. The decorative stones? Let's just say my measuring skills were more artistic than mathematical. And that perfect irrigation system I designed to keep everything watered? Well, it worked a little too well. By the time my parent got home from Michael's latest award ceremony, our front yard looked like a swamp that had been attacked by a lawnmower-wielding maniac. The silence when they pulled into the driveway was deafening. You know that moment in movies when the record scratches and everything goes quiet? That was my life right then. Dad's face went through about 17 different expressions, started with confusion and ending somewhere around existential despair. Mom just stood there with her mouth open, like she was trying to process how this level of destruction was even possible. And Michael? Perfect Michael strolled up, took one look at my landscaping apocalypse, and just smiled that trademark smile of his. Not angry, not disappointed, just amused, like watching a toddler try to solve calculus. Then he patted me on the shoulder and said he'd fix it. Of course he would. Michael always fixed things. That night, lying in bed listening to the sound of Dad's frustrated sighs drifting through the heating vents, I felt something shift inside me. Not anger exactly, more like resignation. Some people are born to stand in spotlights. Others are meant to work the rigging behind the scenes. I was clearly rigging crew in the theater of my own family. But you know what kept me from completely giving up? Those afternoons at Grandpa Joe's farm. That old man had a way of making you feel like the most important person in the world just by listening to you talk about carburetors or crop rotation or whatever random thing was occupying your brain that day. The summer I turned 17, I spent almost every day out at the farm. Michael was off at some elite baseball camp, preparing for his inevitable college career, and my parents were busy managing his scholarship negotiations. I was essentially free to disappear into the world Grandpa Joe had created, where effort mattered more than results and stories were more valuable than statistics. We spent those long, hot days working on the truck, which was finally starting to look like something that might actually run. Grandpa would tell me about his own young adult years, working construction during the economic boom, meeting Grandma Alice at a church social, building their life together one paycheck at a time. He had this way of making ordinary moments feel significant, like the time we were changing the oil in the truck, and he stopped mid-task to point out how the late afternoon light was hitting the barn just right, turning the old red paint into something that looked like it belonged in a museum. Or when we'd take breaks from work to sit on the porch, drinking sweet tea and watching the corn grow, literally watching it grow, because apparently corn grows fast enough that you can see it happen if you're patient enough. Those were the moments that mattered, not the trophies or the newspaper clippings or the college recruitment letters. Just an old man and his grandson, sharing space and time and the comfortable silence that comes when you don't have to prove anything to anyone. Grandpa Joe had this philosophy about life that stuck with me. He believed that every person had something valuable to offer the world, even if nobody else could see it yet. He'd watch me struggle with some problem for hours, never jumping in to solve it for me, just being there while I figured things out on my own. That kind of patience is rarer than finding a $20 bill in your old jeans. In a world where everyone's rushing to fix things or move on to the next problem, he taught me that sometimes the most important thing you can do is just wait. Let people find their own way, even if it takes longer than you'd like. As autumn approached and my senior year of high school loomed ahead, I found myself spending more and more time at the farm. Not just because I loved the work and the stories and the peaceful rhythm of rural life, but because I was starting to sense that something was changing. Grandpa Joe was moving a little slower, sitting down more often, taking longer pauses in his stories like he was searching for words that used to come easily. He never complained, never acted like anything was wrong. But there's something about spending that much time with someone that lets you see past the surface performance to the reality underneath. And the reality was that my grandfather, my mentor, my one true advocate in the world, was getting older in ways that couldn't be fixed with hard work and determination. The last day of that summer, we finally got the truck running. Actually running. Not just turning over or making promising sounds, but purring like a contented cat. I'll never forget the look on Grandpa Joe's face when we took it for that first real drive down the old dirt road that wound through his property. Pure joy mixed with something deeper, something that felt like completion. We drove for maybe 20 minutes, not talking much, just enjoying the moment and the sound of an engine that had been silent for too many years. When we got back to the farmhouse, Grandpa Joe turned off the ignition and just sat there for a minute, his hand still on the steering wheel. Then he looked at me with those clear blue eyes that had seen so much of the world, and he said something I'll never forget. "The world is big, Polly." That's what he called me. Never Paul, always Polly. And even on the smallest farm you can find something great. The important thing is learning how to see it. At the time, I thought he was talking about the satisfaction of honest work, or the beauty of sunrise over cornfields, or the simple pleasure of making something broken whole again. I had no idea he was preparing me for what was coming next, or that those words would become the foundation of everything that followed. That night, driving home in my newly repaired truck with the windows down and the radio playing some classic rock station that came in clear despite being broadcast from 3 states away, I felt something I'd never experienced before. Not happiness exactly, but rightness. Like for the first time in my life, I was exactly where I was supposed to be, doing exactly what I was meant to do. The truck ran smooth as silk, its engine humming with the kind of reliability that only comes from being rebuilt with care and patience and respect for what it used to be. Every mile I drove felt like a small victory, proof that sometimes the things other people write off as worthless just need someone who sees their potential. When I pulled into our driveway that night, Michael's car was already there, fresh back from his baseball camp, and probably full of new stories about scouts and opportunities, and a bright future that was waiting for him like a red carpet. The porch light was on, and I could see my parents through the kitchen window, probably hearing all about his latest achievements over a late dinner. But for once, I didn't feel that familiar stab of invisibility. I had my own stories now, my own accomplishments that mattered to me even if they wouldn't make it onto the refrigerator door. I had learned things that couldn't be measured in trophies or scholarships or newspaper clippings. Most importantly, I had learned to see, just like Grandpa Joe taught me. 3 weeks into my senior year, on a Tuesday morning that started like any other, my mom got the phone call that changed everything. Grandpa Joe had passed away in his sleep, peaceful and quiet, just like he'd lived most of his life. The doctor said his heart just wore out like an old engine that had finally given all it had to give. I didn't cry at first. Couldn't cry. The news felt too big, too impossible to process. Instead, I found myself thinking about that last drive we'd taken together, how content he'd look with his hands on that steering wheel, watching the road ahead like he was seeing it for the first time and the last time simultaneously. The funeral was everything Grandpa Joe would have hated. Too formal, too sad, too focused on endings instead of beginnings. People who barely knew him stood up to say nice things that sounded like they'd been copied from greeting cards. My parents cried the appropriate amount and accepted condolences with the right mixture of grief and gratitude. But when the preacher started talking about Grandpa Joe being in a better place now, I had to step outside. Not because I disagreed, but because I knew that old man's better place had always been right here, working with his hands, sharing stories, teaching patience to whoever was willing to learn it. That's when it hit me. Not the sadness, though that came too, but the realization of what I'd lost. Grandpa Joe hadn't just been my refuge from family dynamics and small-town expectations. He'd been my proof that there were different ways to be successful, different definitions of what made a life worthwhile. Without him, I was back to being the bronze child in a golden family, the supporting character in someone else's story. Except now I knew what it felt like to be the hero of my own narrative, even if that narrative took place in a farmhouse that smelled like motor oil and old leather. The last thing Grandpa Joe had said to me, that afternoon when we got the truck running, kept playing in my head like a song you can't shake. Learn to see, Polly. At the time, I thought I understood what he meant. But standing there in that cemetery, watching them lower the coffin of the only person who'd ever really seen me, I realized I'd only scratched the surface. He wasn't just talking about seeing beauty in ordinary moments or potential in broken-down machinery. He was preparing me for something bigger, something I couldn't even imagine yet. Those words were like seeds he'd planted, waiting for the right conditions to grow into something that would surprise even me. Walking back to that truck after the funeral, feeling the weight of everything that had changed and everything that was about to change, I made a promise to the memory of Joe Wilson. I would learn to see, whatever that meant, wherever it led me. I would honor the faith he'd placed in me by becoming the kind of person who notices what others overlook. I didn't know then that his greatest gift was still waiting for me, hidden in plain sight like everything else he'd tried to teach me. But I was about to find out that sometimes the most valuable lessons come disguised as ordinary moments, and the biggest treasures are the ones nobody else thinks to look for. The world was indeed big, just like he'd always said, and I was finally ready to start exploring it. Grandpa Joe's death didn't just end a life. It severed my only connection to a world where I felt real, where I mattered, where my existence had purpose beyond just taking up space. It was like someone ripped out my roots and left me standing alone in a hurricane, watching the last pieces of my confidence get blown away by winds I couldn't control. Loneliness isn't just the absence of people. It's the absence of meaning. The days after the funeral felt like moving through thick fog. Everything was muffled, distant, like I was watching my own life happen to someone else. My parents went back to their normal routine of celebrating Michael's achievements and managing his college prospects. The scholarship offers were pouring in faster than they could process them. Full rides to schools I'd only seen on TV during bowl games. Meanwhile, I was trying to figure out how to exist in a world without my anchor, my North Star, my one reliable source of unconditional belief. The farm sat empty 40 minutes away, and just thinking about that silence where Grandpa Joe's stories used to live made my chest feel hollow. 2 weeks after the funeral, Mom announced we all needed to meet with Grandpa's lawyer to settle the estate. Standard procedure. She said, probably just some paperwork and maybe a few small mementos to divide up among the family. Dad mentioned something about the farm likely being sold to help with Michael's college expenses and some long overdue renovations to our house. The appointment was set for a Tuesday afternoon at the law office of Harold Pemberton, a man who looked exactly like what you'd expect from someone who'd been handling small-town legal matters since the Carter administration, with paneling, leather-bound books, and the kind of quiet authority that comes from watching families navigate their most complicated moments for 40 years. We sat in those uncomfortable chairs that every lawyer's office seems to order from the same catalog of intimidation furniture. Mom fidgeted with her purse strap. Dad checked his watch twice in 5 minutes. Michael scrolled through his phone, probably reading messages from coaches who were still trying to recruit him even though he'd already made his decision. And me? I just sat there thinking about how strange it felt to be settling someone's life into neat legal categories when that person had been so much more than property and possessions and bank account balances. Mr. Pemberton cleared his throat and opened a file that looked thicker than I'd expected. He started with the standard items, some savings account distributions, a few family heirlooms that would go to Dad, Grandpa's old pickup truck that everyone assumed would be sold for scrap value. Then he paused, looked directly at me, and said something that changed everything. Your grandfather left specific instructions regarding the farm property. According to his will, dated just 6 months ago, he's leaving the entire farm and all associated assets to Paul Wilson, with the understanding that it represents his belief in Paul's potential to honor the land and the legacy it represents. The silence in that room was so complete, you could hear the fluorescent lights humming overhead. Dad's face went through about 12 different expressions in the span of 10 seconds. Mom's mouth opened and closed like a fish trying to breathe air. Michael finally looked up from his phone, but with this expression of mild annoyance, like someone had interrupted his important business with trivial family drama. But then Mom found her voice, and when she did, it came out like a fire alarm going off in a library. "This is ridiculous," she said. "This is unfair. Paul manipulated him. Paul spent all that time out there filling his head with nonsense about farming and old trucks and who knows what else. This isn't right." Dad didn't say anything at first, just sat there clenching and unclenching his fists like he was trying to squeeze the frustration out through his fingertips. Then he started talking about practicality, about how an 18-year-old kid couldn't possibly manage a farm, about how the sensible thing would be to sell the property and use the money for more important things. More important things. Like Michael's living expenses that his scholarship didn't cover, the fancy off-campus apartment he'd had his eye on, the training gear, the spring break trips with his new college teammates, the kitchen renovation Mom had been planning, the family vacation to Europe they'd been talking about taking once Michael graduated. Michael, perfect Michael, just leaned back in his chair and gave me that half smirk he wore whenever I stumbled, like he was watching a rerun of his favorite sitcom. Then he spoke up for the first time since we'd arrived. "Look, little brother," he said, and even the way he said little brother sounded condescending. "I know you spent a lot of time out there with the old man, and that's sweet and all, but let's be realistic here. You don't know anything about running a farm. You don't have the money to maintain the property. You don't even have a real job. The smart thing, the responsible thing, would be to sell it and let the adults handle the money." That's when something shifted inside me, something that had been building pressure, for years, suddenly found its release valve. I'd spent my entire life being told what the smart thing was, what the responsible thing was, what the realistic thing was. Always by people who measure success in trophies and scholarships and other people's approval. But sitting there in that lawyer's office, listening to my family discuss my inheritance like it was their property to redistribute, I realized something important. For the first time in my life, I had something that was mine, really mine. Something that came to me not because I was a consolation prize or the backup plan, but because someone had chosen me specifically. Mr. Pemberton was explaining the legal details, how the property transfer would work, what responsibilities came with ownership. But all I could hear was Grandpa Joe's voice echoing in my memory. The world is big, Polly, and even on the smallest farm you can find something great. The important thing is learning how to see. My family kept talking around me, about me, but not to me, making plans for my life that didn't include my opinion. And that's when I realized I had a choice to make. I could go along with their practical, sensible, responsible plan and spend the rest of my life wondering what might have been. Or I could do something that terrified me more than anything I'd ever considered. I could say no. One word. 2 letters. The smallest complete sentence in the English language. But when I said it, the effect on that room was like dropping a grenade into a tea party. No, I repeated, a little louder this time. I'm keeping the farm. Mom's face went through several shades of red that don't have names in the standard color wheel. Dad looked like someone had told him the farm had turned into dust overnight. And Michael? Michael's expression shifted from amused condescension to something much less friendly. The argument that followed was everything you'd expect from a family discovering that their quiet, compliant member had suddenly grown a backbone. Accusations flew like confetti at a parade. I was being selfish. I was being unrealistic. I was throwing away my future and theirs for some romantic fantasy about rural life. But here's the thing about finally standing up for yourself after years of being invisible. Once you start, it's surprisingly hard to stop. Every criticism they threw at me just made me more certain that this was exactly what I needed to do. Not because I had any clear plan or because I was confident about my chances of success, but because it was mine to fail at. The meeting ended with Dad doing that thing that American fathers do when they're too frustrated for words, but too dignified for yelling. He pulled out his wallet, extracted a set of keys, and placed them on Mr. Pemberton's desk with the kind of deliberate precision that speaks louder than shouting. Those were the keys to Grandpa's old pickup truck, the one we'd spent so many afternoons rebuilding together. Dad's message was clear without him having to say a word. Take your truck, take your farm. Take your stubborn independence, and figure out how to make it work without any help from us. Mom was less subtle. She made it very clear that if I was determined to throw my life away on this foolish venture, I shouldn't expect any family support when reality inevitably came crashing down. Michael just shook his head like he was watching a train wreck in slow motion, then made some comment about how I'd come crawling back within 6 months. The ride home was silent, except for the sound of disappointment filling the car like toxic gas. When we pulled into our driveway, I didn't even go inside. Just transferred a few belongings from my room to the truck bed, left a note on my pillow saying I'd call when I got settled, and drove away from the only home I'd ever known. The 40-minute drive to farm felt like crossing into another country. With every mile, the weight of my family's expectations lifted a little more, replaced by something that felt simultaneously like freedom and terror. I was 18 years old, had about $400 in my checking account, and was now the sole owner of a property that held more memories than money. When I pulled up to the farmhouse that first evening, as its owner, the place looked different somehow. The peeling paint on the shutters that seemed charming during weekend visits now looked more honest. The front porch that had been perfect for storytelling still sagged a little, but it was my sag now. Inside, the house felt like a museum of one man's life. Grandpa's coffee mug still sat by the kitchen sink. His reading glasses were folded on the side table next to his favorite chair. Everything was exactly as he'd left it, waiting for someone to decide what came next. That first night, I couldn't sleep. The house felt like a shrine, too full of memory and meaning. I lay on Grandpa's couch, wondering if I'd just made the worst decision of my life, or the best. The silence was different here than in town. Deeper, more honest, like it was waiting for me to fill it with something worthwhile. In that darkness, surrounded by the creaks and settles of an old house that was slowly becoming mine, I didn't feel like a rebel or a runaway. I felt like a kid who just inherited a story too big for him to tell, but was going to try anyway. The house creaked around me like it was settling in for a new chapter. And in that stillness, I made a quiet promise to man who'd seen something in me no one else ever had. I didn't know how to run a farm. I didn't know much at all. But I knew this. I wouldn't let Grandpa's faith in me go unanswered, not without trying. Tomorrow would ask questions I wasn't ready to answer, but at least they'd be mine to figure out. The first few weeks on a farm were a challenge, not just difficult. More like someone forgot to turn off survival mode, and I was stuck playing on expert level with a broken controller. I lived on ramen noodles, slept in Grandpa's old bed that creaked like a haunted house, and every muscle in my body screamed for mercy on a daily basis. But you know what they say about rock bottom? It makes a pretty solid foundation to build on. And somewhere between the stacks of old newspapers and the dust that covered everything like a gray blanket, there was a spark flickering, my own stubborn little spark of hope. Turns out, 18-year-old me had some pretty optimistic ideas about farm life. I'd picture myself waking up with the roosters, working the land with my hands, living off the grid like some kind of modern-day pioneer. Reality was more like waking up to discover the water heater had died. The roof leaked in 3 different places, and something was definitely wrong with the septic system. The learning curve was steeper than a ski jump in Colorado. Every day brought a new crisis that required skills I definitely didn't learn in high school. How do you fix a well pump? What's the difference between a hay baler and a hay rake? Why does everything on a farm cost approximately 3 times what you think it should? My $400 disappeared faster than free pizza at a college dorm. Within the first month, I was down to eating generic mac and cheese and whatever vegetables I could salvage from Grandpa's overgrown garden. The electricity bill alone nearly gave me a heart attack. Apparently, old farmhouses weren't built with energy efficiency in mind. But here's the thing about desperation. It makes you resourceful. I learned to fix things with duct tape and prayer. I figured out which repairs were urgent and which ones could wait until I had money that didn't exist yet. I discovered that YouTube University offers surprisingly comprehensive curriculum in basic farm maintenance. 3 weeks into my new life as a struggling farmer, I was in the barn trying to figure out why the ancient tractor wouldn't start when I heard a voice behind me. A voice that made me look up so fast, I nearly concussed myself on the engine hood. Emily McGregor was standing in the doorway. And let me tell you, she was not what I expected when I heard we had neighbors. She had this confidence that seemed to radiate from her like heat from a campfire, work boots that had actually seen work, and a smile that could probably power the whole county if someone figured out how to harness it. She introduced herself as a daughter of the neighboring farm, explained that her dad had been wondering if the new owner needed any help getting started. What she didn't mention, but what I figured out pretty quickly, was that she knew more about farming than I knew about anything. Emily had that particular brand of competence that comes from growing up on working land. She could look at a broken piece of equipment and immediately know what was wrong with it. She understood crop rotation, soil composition, and animal husbandry like I understood the lyrics to classic rock songs, which is to say, better than most things in life. The first time she offered to help, I was trying to repair a section of fence that looked like it had been attacked by a very determined tornado. I'd been working on it for 3 hours and had somehow made it worse. She watched me struggle for about 5 minutes before politely suggesting a different approach. 20 minutes later, the fence was fixed, and I was wondering if maybe I should just hire her to run the place while I went back to school. But Emily had other ideas. She started showing up regularly, teaching me things I needed to know, sharing equipment that her family had extras of, and generally preventing me from turning Grandpa's farm into a cautionary tale. It was Emily who suggested we try to revive one of Grandpa's old projects, his cheese recipe. She heard from her dad that Joe Wilson used to make this incredible artisanal cheese called Golden West, something he developed during his early years on the farm but had stopped producing when Grandma Alice got sick. The recipe was tucked away in a shoebox along with some of Grandpa's other papers. Handwritten notes on aging, temperature control, and ingredient ratios that looked like they'd been perfected through years of trial and error. Emily looked at those notes like an archaeologist examining ancient treasure maps. The McGregors had a small dairy operation, and Emily convinced her dad to let us use some of their fresh milk for our experiments. Having access to high-quality, farm-fresh milk was going to be crucial if we wanted to recreate Grandpa's legendary cheese. Our first attempt at cheese making was educational. That's the polite way of saying it was an absolute disaster that probably violated several laws of physics. What came out of our improvised cheese press looked like something you find growing under a bridge, and the smell was what I imagined a gym sock would smell like if it could go bad. Emily stood there holding this gray, lumpy mass that was supposed to be cheese, and for a moment I thought she was going to quit before we'd really started. Instead, she started laughing. Not polite, trying to be nice laughing, but the kind of deep, genuine laughter that makes you realize someone might actually be crazy enough to stick around for the long haul. We tried again, and again. Each batch was a new adventure in creative failure. We made cheese that could double as a doorstop, cheese that had the consistency of pudding, and one memorable batch that seemed to be actively fighting back. Emily would toss whatever monstrosity we created into the compost pile and say something like, "Well, at least we're feeding the soil." By the fifth attempt, we were starting to understand what Grandpa's notes actually meant. The temperature had to be just right, not hot enough to cook the curds, but warm enough to encourage the proper separation. The timing was crucial. Too long and you got mush, too short and you got rocks. The aging process required patience that neither of us naturally possessed. It was during our seventh attempt that something magical happened. Emily was stirring the milk while I monitored the temperature, both of us covering away splashes and milk stains, looking like we'd been wrestling with a very messy dairy cow. The curds formed perfectly, the whey separated cleanly, and when we pressed the cheese, it actually looked like something you might find in a store. 3 weeks later, when we cut into that first successful wheel of Golden West cheese, it was like discovering buried treasure. Rich, complex flavors that somehow capture the essence of summer afternoons and fresh grass and everything good about farm life. We sat there on Grandpa's front porch, eating cheese and crackers and feeling like we just invented fire. Emily had connections at the local farmers market through her family's operations. She convinced me to bring a few wheels of our cheese to see if anyone would actually pay money for what we created. I was nervous as a long-tailed cat in a room full of rocking chairs, convinced that our success was just beginner's luck. But people loved it, really loved it. The Golden West cheese had this unique flavor profile that none of the other local producers were offering. By our third week at the market, we had a waiting list of customers who wanted to reserve wheels in advance. Food bloggers from the city started driving out to try our cheese and write reviews that made us sound like culinary geniuses. Within 2 months, we were selling every wheel we could produce. The demand was so high that we were turning away customers, which is the kind of problem every small business dreams of having. Emily and I started talking about expansion, about buying more equipment, about turning this accidental success into something that could actually sustain the farm long term. But expansion required capital, and capital was something we definitely didn't have. The cheese operation was profitable, but the margins were tight when you factored in ingredient costs, equipment maintenance, and all the other expenses that come with running a small food business. We needed a significant injection of cash to take things to the next level. That's when I started going through more of Grandpa's belongings, looking for anything that might be valuable enough to sell or use as collateral for a loan. Most of it was exactly what you'd expect from a lifetime of rural living. Old tools, worn furniture, clothes that smelled like mothballs and memories. But in the back corner of his bedroom closet, behind boxes of Christmas decorations and winter coats, I found an old trunk that I'd somehow missed during my initial exploration of the house. Heavy bound with metal strips, the kind of chest that looked like it sailed on pirate ships or crossed the frontier in covered wagons. Inside the trunk was a collection of Grandpa's most personal possessions, letters from Grandma Alice when they were courting, photographs from their early years together, military discharge papers from his brief stint in the Army, and at the bottom, wrapped in tissue paper that had yellowed with age, was a stamp album. I'd seen Grandpa with his stamps before, of course. He'd show me some of his favorites during those long afternoons when he was teaching me about seeing the world through different eyes. But this album was different somehow, more carefully organized, like it contained his most prized pieces rather than just random collections. As I flipped through the pages, looking at stamps from countries that didn't exist anymore and postmarks from decades past, something fell out from between the pages. A single stamp, mounted on a small card, that immediately caught my attention because something about it looked wrong. It was an airmail stamp, the kind used for letters that traveled by plane in the early days of aviation. But the airplane in the center of the stamp was upside down, printed in reverse of how it should have appeared. My first thought was that it was a printing error, a mistake that had somehow made it through quality control. I set the stamp aside without giving it much more thought. After all, Grandpa had always talked about his collection as a visual diary of places and times, not as an investment portfolio. For him, stamps were about stories and memories, not monetary value. A printing error would have been just another interesting quirk in his collection of postal curiosities. The trunk held other treasures too, a pocket watch that had stopped at 317, but started ticking perfectly when I wounded up some old coins that might have been worth something to collectors, a few pieces of jewelry that had belonged to Grandma Alice. Enough stuff that I thought maybe, with some careful selling, I could raise enough money to buy the equipment Emily and I needed to expand our cheese operation. But as I was packing everything back into the trunk for safekeeping, I kept looking at that upside-down airplane stamp. Something about it nagged at me, like trying to remember a song you've heard but can't quite place. It was just so perfectly wrong, so precisely incorrect, that it seemed almost intentional rather than accidental. I made a mental note to look into it later, maybe do some research online to see if printing errors like that had any value to collectors. But honestly, my main focus was on the immediate challenge of keeping the farm running and the cheese business growing. A stamp with an upside-down airplane seemed like the least of my priorities. Emily and I spent the rest of that summer perfecting our cheese recipes and building our customer base. We developed 3 different varieties of Golden West, each with its own aging process and flavor profile. The original became our signature, but we also created a smoke version and an herb-infused variety that became incredibly popular with the restaurant crowd. The farmers market became our second home. Every Saturday, we'd load up the truck with wheels of cheese, wheels of hope, and drive into town to set up our booth. Emily had this natural gift for talking to customers, explaining the cheese-making process, and making people feel like they were part of something special by buying our products. But success brought its own challenges. We were maxing out our current equipment, working longer hours than seemed sustainable, and constantly turning away potential customers because we simply couldn't produce enough cheese to meet demand. The opportunity was there, begging us to seize it, but we needed more space, better equipment, and additional aging facilities. The math was simple but intimidating. To expand properly, we needed about $50,000. That might as well have been $50 million for 2 young people whose biggest asset was a rundown farm and a recipe for artisanal cheese. Banks weren't exactly lining up to lend money to teenagers with big dreams and minimal collateral. That night, sitting on the front porch after another successful but exhausting day at the market, Emily and I talked about our options. We could try to grow slowly, reinvesting every penny of profit back into business. We could look for investors, though finding someone willing to bet on small-town cheese makers seemed unlikely. Or we could accept that maybe we'd reached the natural limit of what our operation could achieve. None of those options felt right. We had something special, something that could really make a difference for the farm and for our future together. But we needed a miracle, a stroke of luck, some unexpected windfall that would give us the capital to turn our cottage industry into a real business. The future felt uncertain, but for the first time since I'd inherited the farm, it also felt full of possibilities. What had started as a working partnership between Emily and me had quietly grown into something deeper over those months of building our cheese business together. She'd been spending more and more time at the farm, and somewhere between failed batches of cheese and late-night planning sessions, we'd fallen for each other. She practically lived here now, her laugh filling rooms that had been silent for too long. One evening, After Emily had fallen asleep following another exhausting day of cheesemaking, I found myself doing what any modern American does when faced with impossible problems, scrolling through YouTube and hoping for divine intervention through Wi-Fi. I was supposedly researching cheese-making equipment for our expansion dreams, but the algorithm had a mind of its own that night. One click led to another, and before I knew it, I'd stumbled across a video titled Top 10 Most Expensive Objects Ever Sold. Sometimes the best discoveries happen when you're not even looking for them. I clicked on the video without expecting much. Rich people buying overpriced art, rare cars that cost more than small countries' GDP, the usual suspects. But then the presenter got to a section that made me pause. Stamps. Who knew that little pieces of paper could be worth more than most people's houses? There was, right at number 2 on the list, the inverted Jenny, a 1918 airmail stamp where the airplane was printed upside down by mistake. According to the video, one had sold for over $4 million just a few years earlier. The screen showed a blue stamp with a red airplane flying inverted, like it was doing aerobatics for a very wealthy audience. My heart did something that felt like missing a step going downstairs. That airplane, that exact upside-down airplane. I'd seen it before and recently. My brain started connecting the dots faster than a detective in a noir movie, and every connection led back to that trunk in Grandpa's bedroom. I practically flew up those stairs, taking them 3 at a time like the house was on fire. The trunk was exactly where I'd left it, and my hands were shaking so badly I could barely work the latches. Old letters, photographs, that pocket watch that had started ticking again when I wound it up, and there, wrapped in tissue paper that felt older than democracy, was the stamp album. I flipped through those pages like my life depended on it, and maybe it did. Page after page of stamps from places that didn't exist anymore, postal history from before my grandparents were even born. And then, tucked between 2 pages near the back, was a small mounting card with a stamp that made the world stop spinning. The inverted Jenny. The actual, honest-to-God, one of 24 known to exist, inverted Jenny. In my grandfather's stamp album, treated like just another interesting postal curiosity from the early days of airmail service. Grandpa Joe, bless his practical soul, had probably bought this stamp for pocket change at some small-town post office in 1918. Thinking it was a fun mistake to add to his collection of travel memories. He'd had no idea he was holding what would become one of the most valuable stamps in the world. To him, it was just another story, another piece of postal history worth preserving. But sitting there on his bedroom floor at 2 a.m, holding what might be our ticket to everything we dreamed of, I felt like I was touching lightning. This wasn't just a stamp. It was a miracle disguised as a printing error. I spent the next hour on my laptop, researching everything I could find about inverted Jennies, how to authenticate them, what made them valuable, where they'd been sold, who owned the known copies. The more I read, the more convinced I became that what I held in my trembling hands was the real deal. When Emily woke up around sunrise and found me still sitting on the bedroom floor, surrounded by printouts and laptop screens, she probably thought I'd finally lost my mind from the stress of trying to make the farm work. Her expression went from concern to confusion to absolute disbelief as I explained what I discovered. My partner's first reaction was exactly what you'd expect from someone with more sense than I had. This was Grandpa's stamp, she said. This was his history, his collection, his memory. How could I even think about selling something that meant so much to him? What if it wasn't authentic? What if we were chasing fool's gold disguised as postal history? But then I reminded her of something Grandpa Joe had always said. He didn't collect stamps as investments. He collected them as stories. And the greatest story the stamp could tell wasn't sitting in an album gathering dust. It was helping us build something that would honor his memory and fulfill his dreams for farm. This wasn't just Joe's memory. I told her this was Joe's legacy. Grandpa had wanted us to be happy, to make something meaningful out of the land he'd loved. This stamp was his gift to us, his way of making sure we had the resources to turn his farm into something that could thrive and grow and feed people for generations to come. She looked at that stamp for a long time, and I could see her practical mind wrestling with her sentimental heart. Finally, Emily nodded. But if we were going to do this, we were going to do it right. Professional authentication, proper appraisal, Legitimate auction house. No shortcuts. No get-rich-quick schemes. No hoping for the best and praying for miracles. We didn't wait. Sometimes irrational urgency is exactly what a moment like that demands. We packed that stamp like it was made of eggshells and dynamite, wrapped in more protective material than a NASA space probe. The 3-hour drive to the city was a mixture of euphoria and paranoia that probably violated several traffic laws. I kept glancing the rear-view mirror like we were being followed by stamp thieves, which of course we weren't. Probably. Emily kept asking questions we couldn't answer. What if it's a fake? What if the expert laughs us out of the building? What if we're about to embarrass ourselves in front of people who know more about stamps than we know about cheese? But then we'd look at each other and start laughing, because the whole situation was so absurd it had to be true. 2 small-town cheese makers driving to Chicago with what might be a multi-million-dollar stamp hidden in a farm truck that smelled like aged cheddar and unrealistic dreams. If someone made a movie about this, nobody would believe the plot. The stamp authentication process was more nerve-wracking than any final exam I'd ever taken. The expert, a man who looked like he'd been appraising valuable paper since the Pony Express, examined our stamp under more magnification than the Hubble telescope uses to look at distant galaxies. Every minute felt like an hour. Every pause in his examination felt like a verdict being rendered. We sat in those uncomfortable chairs that auction houses seem to specialize in, holding hands and trying not to hyperventilate while our entire future hung in the balance of one man's professional opinion. When he finally looked up and confirmed that what we had was indeed an authentic inverted Jenny in remarkable condition, I'm pretty sure I forgot how to breathe for about 30 seconds. She squeezed my hand so hard, I thought bones might snap, but I didn't care because we just won the lottery without buying a ticket. The auction was scheduled for the following month, but the preliminary estimates were enough to make my head spin. $7 million. Maybe more, depending on bidding competition and market conditions. $7 million for a stamp that Grandpa Joe had probably bought for 24 cents nearly a century ago. That night in the hotel, neither of us could sleep. We lay awake talking about what this meant. Not just the money, though the money was obviously life-changing, but the opportunity to build something lasting, something that would honor Grandpa's memory while creating our own legacy. When the final hammer fell at the auction house 6 weeks later, our little upside-down airplane had sold for $7.2 million. After taxes and auction fees, we were left with enough money to transform not just a farm, but our entire vision of what the farm could become. First things first, we officially incorporated Legacy Joe Creamery as a proper business. No more kitchen table operations and handshake deals. We hired a team of skilled cheese makers who could help us scale production while maintaining the quality that had made Golden West special. Emily took charge of operations while I focused on the business side, learning everything about food safety regulations, distribution networks, and retail partnerships. Legacy Joe Creamery rose from those old farm buildings like something out of a dream. State-of-the-art cheese-making facilities, temperature-controlled aging caves, a visitor center where people could learn about traditional cheese-making while tasting the results. Our Golden West cheese went from being a local farmer's market curiosity to a nationally distributed artisanal product that food magazines wrote articles about. Each wheel of cheese we produced was more than just food. It was a time capsule containing the essence of summer afternoons, the wisdom of an old man who understood that the best things in life are made with patience and care, and a piece of the American dream that still believes hard work and unexpected luck can change everything. Standing in our new facility, watching our team package cheese for shipment to restaurants across the country, I felt something I'd never experienced before. Not just success, but the deep satisfaction that comes from building something meaningful with your own hands and heart. But success this dramatic doesn't go unnoticed, especially in towns where grudges grow deeper than roots. And when money enters the picture, even ghosts get lawyers. The wedding. Our wedding under the old oak tree on the farm wasn't just a celebration. It was the embodiment of everything we dreamed of building together. Sunlight filtered through the leaves like nature's own stained glass, and every corner of the farm that we rebuilt with our own hands seemed to breathe with happiness. Emily looked radiant in her simple white dress, and I stood there in my best suit, finally understanding what it meant to be exactly where you belong. This was my home, my family, my future all wrapped up in one perfect moment. It was a kind of idyllic scene that, as I would soon learn, usually comes right before the storm. The first few months after our wedding were probably the happiest of my life. Legacy Joe Creamery was thriving beyond our wildest expectations. We had distributors calling us, food magazines writing features about our artisanal cheese-making process, and a waiting list of restaurants wanted to feature our Golden West varieties on their menus. Emily and I had found our rhythm as business partners and life partners. She ran operations with the kind of quiet efficiency that made everything look effortless, while I handled the business development and tried not to mess up the financial side of things too badly. But success, especially the kind that comes with million-dollar stories and national media attention, has a way of casting long shadows. And sometimes those shadows contain people you thought you'd left behind for good. It was a Tuesday afternoon in late October when the ghost of my past came knocking. Emily and I were in the aging cave, checking on our latest batch of cheese wheels, when one of our employees came running in with a look of confusion mixed with concern. There were people at the main gate, she said, people claiming to be family, demanding to speak with the owner. I knew before I even walked outside who it would be. Some instincts never leave you, especially the ones developed during 18 years of family dynamics that would make a soap opera writer jealous. There they were, standing by their rental car like they owned the place. Mom, Dad, and Michael, all dressed in their Sunday best and wearing expressions that mixed surprise, resentment, and barely concealed greed in equal measures. They looked around at our operation with the kind of wide-eyed amazement usually reserved for touring celebrity mansions. The transformation of the farm had been dramatic. What was once a collection of rundown buildings and overgrown fields was now a modern agricultural operation that looked like something out of a farming magazine. The cheese-making facility gleamed in the afternoon sun. Our visitor center bustled with tourists, and the whole place had an air of prosperity that was impossible to ignore. My family had clearly done their homework. They knew about the stamp, the auction, the millions of dollars, and our business success. What they hadn't anticipated was facing the son and brother they'd written off, now standing on property he owned, running a company he'd built from nothing. Mom was the first to find her voice, and when she did, it came out like a fire hose of righteous indignation. This wasn't fair, she declared. The farm should have gone to the whole family. I'd manipulated Grandpa Joe in his final years, filled his head with nonsense about farming and legacy while isolating him from his real family. The stamp belonged to all of them, not just me. Dad stood behind her, nodding along with a kind of grim determination that suggested they'd practiced this speech during the drive from town. Michael just smiled that trademark smile of his, the one that had always made me feel like a child pretending to play adult games. Then Michael stepped forward and delivered what was clearly meant to be the killing blow. They were contesting the will. He announced their lawyer had found irregularities in Grandpa's mental state during his final months. They had witnesses who would testify that I'd unduly influenced an elderly man for financial gain. They were going to court, and when they won, I'd be forced to split everything equally among the family. The threat hung in the air like a thundercloud. This was their power play, their attempt to claim a piece of success they'd had no part in creating. They expected me to crumble, to negotiate, to remember my place as a family disappointment who should be grateful for whatever scraps they threw his way. Instead, I started laughing. Not bitter laughter or angry laughter, but the genuine amusement of someone who finally sees a punchline to a joke that's been building for years. Here they were, the family who treated me like an invisible afterthought, suddenly discovering that blood was thicker than water when money was involved. Michael's confident expression faltered slightly as my laughter continued. He'd expected anger, pleading, maybe even submission. But laughter? That wasn't in his playbook. I told them to do their worst, hire their lawyers, make their threats. The will was ironclad. The property was legally mine, and their sudden interest in family unity was about 3 years and $7 million too late. The court case that followed was everything you'd expect from a family dispute with serious money at stake. Lawyers, depositions, character witnesses, and enough paperwork to deforest a small country. My family's attorney painted me as a manipulative opportunist who'd preyed on an elderly man's loneliness. My lawyer, recommended by Mr. Pemberton, the same attorney who'd handled Grandpa's will, painted a very different picture. Turns out, when you have documentation going back years showing a genuine relationship between grandfather and grandson, when you have neighbors willing to testify about that relationship, and when the opposing side can't produce any evidence of mental incompetence or undue influence, the case becomes pretty straightforward. The real fireworks came when Michael took the stand. Perfect Michael, who'd spent his entire life being the golden child, suddenly found himself under cross-examination by a lawyer who'd been practicing longer than Michael had been breathing. The mask of confident superiority slipped, and what emerged was a man who couldn't handle not being the center of attention. He started raising his voice, gesturing wildly, making accusations that had no basis in fact. The judge, a woman who clearly had no patience for courtroom theatrics, shut him down so fast it was almost comical. She reminded him that this was a court of law, not a family therapy session, and if he couldn't conduct himself appropriately, he'd be held in contempt. That moment, watching my supposedly perfect brother lose control in front of a room full of strangers, was when I realized I'd won more than just a legal case. I'd won my freedom from everything he represented, from the need to compete, to measure myself against his achievements, to define my worth by his standards. As Mark Twain once said, never let schooling interfere with your education. I'd add to that, never let other people's expectations interfere with your life. Because the education I'd gotten from building something of my own was worth more than any degree, and the life I created was worth more than any approval. The verdict was swift and decisive. The will stood as written. The property remained mine, and my family's attempt to claim a piece of my success died in that courtroom. But winning the case was just the beginning of something larger, the process of deciding what kind of person I want to be now that I had the power to choose. Months passed before I heard from my parents again. When they finally reached out, it was different, humbler. They came to the farm alone without Michael, and the conversation that followed was unlike any we'd ever had. Mom cried when she apologized. Real tears, not the performative kind she'd used during the court case. She admitted they'd been wrong, that they'd treated me unfairly, that their lawsuit had been motivated by greed rather than principle. Dad, who'd always been a man of few words, simply said he was proud of what I'd built and ashamed of how long it had taken him to see it. I could have turned them away, could have told them that their apology was too little, too late, that they'd forfeited their right to be part of my life when they chose money over family. But standing there, looking at two people who'd aged years in the span of months, I remembered something Grandpa Joe had taught me. Forgiveness isn't about the other person deserving it. It's about you being free enough to give it. I was finally free from their expectations, their approval, their ability to make me feel small. And that freedom meant I could choose to help them, not because I owed them anything, but because I wanted to. I didn't give them money, but I gave them something more valuable, a relationship without conditions. We started having Sunday dinners together. Awkward at first, but gradually warming into something that resembled a family I'd always wished we could be. Michael never came. Not to the farm. Not to dinner, not to any of the attempts my parents made to rebuild our family relationships. He'd moved to California, they said, was working in tech, had married someone they'd never met. He sent Christmas cards but never called, existed in our lives as a carefully maintained distance that everyone pretended not to notice. I stopped waiting for him to come around. Some people can't handle being wrong, and some bridges aren't meant to be rebuilt. That was his choice to make. And I'd finally learned that I couldn't make it for him. Today, Legacy Joe Creamery employs over 30 people and ships our cheese to restaurants and specialty stores across the country. The farm that was once my refuge has become a destination, a place where people come to learn about traditional cheese making and taste the results of patience and craftsmanship. In my office, next to a photograph of Grandpa Joe standing by a beloved pickup truck, hangs a framed copy of the inverted Jenny stamp. Not the original, that belongs to the collector now, but a reproduction that reminds me daily of the most important lesson I ever learned. Sometimes the biggest treasures are the things we initially think are worthless. An old farm that nobody wanted, a relationship that started with spilled milk and failed cheese, a stamp with an upside-down airplane that looked like a mistake. But the real treasure wasn't the money or the success or even the farm itself. It was the freedom to be myself, earned through the simple act of refusing to live in anyone else's shadow. I'd found my path, built my legacy, and discovered that the real gold had been inside me all along. As I write this, sitting on the same front porch where Grandpa Joe used to tell his stories, I can hear Emily laughing with our employees as they prepare for tomorrow's farmer's market. The sound fills the evening air like music, and I know that this moment, this life, this hard-won independence, is exactly what that wise old man always knew I could achieve. I finally learned how to see, and what I saw was beautiful.